All right. Hello, and welcome to Nature Connects, TNC in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Tricia Yadley. I am the Atlantic Coast Offshore Wind Policy Manager for the Nature Conservancy. I coordinate TNC's offshore wind work along the Atlantic coast and shape that work into a cohesive, deliberate strategy that advances offshore wind at the pace and scale needed to mitigate climate change, while also ensuring that we're using the best approaches to maximize the benefits that offshore wind can deliver to people and nature. To do this, I coordinate with TNC state chapters along the Atlantic coast, our science and policy staff, and I coordinate with our Gulf of Mexico, West Coast, Great Lakes, and European teams. As part of TNC's efforts to find ways to maximize the benefits that offshore wind can deliver to our communities and the marine environment, we partnered with Vermont Law and Graduate School's Institute of Energy and the Environment and asked them to prepare this report that you're going to learn about today. The report surveys how states have been using their state energy buying processes, not only to buy offshore wind at the best price for ratepayers, but also to incentivize developers to provide other benefits to the environment and the community. Today's webinar will feature a discussion on the findings outlined in this report. We'll be joined by Mark James, Kira Janish, Irvin Yar III, and John Small. We're all part of the research team that developed this incredibly useful report. Before we dive into today's program, I'd like to share a little more with you about our guests. Mark James is a visiting assistant professor and a senior energy fellow at the Institute for Energy and the Environment at the Vermont Law and Graduate School. He led this research project and recently moderated a panel at the Marine Affairs Institute Symposium that TNC co-hosted on this topic in Rhode Island in April. He is joined by three of the law students who contributed to this report. Kira Janish is a 2L originally from Chicago. Irvin Yar III is a 2L originally from Iowa. And John Small is a 2L originally from California. I'll ask that as you think of questions for our panelists to please enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And when we get to that portion of the program, we'll be asking panelists some of those questions. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Mark, I'm going to pass it on to you to get started.
Thank you, Trish. So I want to say thank you to Nature Conservancy for supporting this report, and thank you to the law school for allowing us to do this type of work and to bring students in to do the work with us. Just a couple of key takeaways to sort of set the scene for what we're going to talk about. We're looking at a very exciting time in offshore wind, a lot changing, a lot of procurement targets being increased. 5 states are going to complete solicitations this year. And our report started to look into how do we maximize those environmental benefits. And what we found is that there's not really clear legislative direction to use the type of criteria that we're seeing in Europe to advance net positive goals, including nature inclusive design. So the report goes into great detail. I urge you the link to it will be posted in the chat. I urge you to download it and contact us if you have any questions. So just to set the scene, we have a key moment to act. We are moving from 42 megawatts to an anticipated 77 gigawatts. That might even be on the low side, 1,000-fold increase in offshore wind. So this is an opportunity to capture economic, environmental, social, and cultural impacts and benefits. And the rules that we have today for how those projects are built will determine how those projects are built in the next decade. And so as we will demonstrate that words are very important, if we want to achieve all those possible benefits, we need to be purposeful in how we design the processes for securing and soliciting that offshore wind information. So I'm going to go through some key terms before I turn it over to my colleagues to dive deeper into the report, just kind of set the scene. The first one is compensatory mitigation. In other words, avoid, minimize, and mitigate. And that really has been the focus of US state solicitation processes. How do we reduce the negative environmental impacts of constructing and operating offshore wind farms? It is focused on a minimization of impacts rather than a maximization of benefits. And that is what we see an opportunity to do. We've identified that there are opportunities to do that. And so some new terms to think about. We want to be net positive. We want to produce a net gain. So how do you go beyond mitigation? How do you go beyond mitigating the harms to actually producing a net benefit? And there's in the chart here, you can see that avoid, minimize, mitigate, but we want to go beyond that. We want to bring back and add in ecological function, increase the biodiversity in marine and aquatic environments. And they can do that through how projects are designed and operated. And those individual projects that produce a net gain move us towards a nature positive goal, which really is to stop and reverse the loss of biodiversity and ecological function. How does that happen? Well, it starts off with the non-price criteria. So if you go out to solicit offshore wind, price is a major component of that when you're going to evaluate between different proposals that are received. What do non-price criteria do? They allow us to advance other non-economic policy goals. They allow us to identify weaknesses and strengths that aren't always captured in a purely economic analysis. These are some of the examples of common ones that we're seeing in the US and in Europe, and we'll talk more in depth about those. But non-price criteria are the sort of the key to unlocking those potential benefits. And the final term I'm going to talk about is the solicitation process. We have to understand how this works, that we need to know how do we go from paperwork to turbines in the water. And in the state level, it's states that are running the solicitation processes. You start with a request for proposal. You have to determine what's going to be solicited. You have to determine who's going to take in and evaluate those proposals, how they're going to be evaluated. Again, coming back to the use of non-price criteria. And then contracts are negotiated, contracts get approved. Again, there's an evaluation process that goes along with that. And each one of these steps, there are authorities and powers available to state agencies to shape and direct the outcomes that the solicitation produces. What do we want to get is set forth by regulation and legislation. And with that, to take a deeper dive in, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Irvin, who will begin to talk about what's happening in some of the states.
Thank you, Mark. The 6 states I'm going to be discussing are split into states that give ORECs and energy. The first trio is New York, New Jersey, and Maryland, which go for offshore renewable energy credits, which are those ORECs. A benefit of this OREC system is it's run by the state utility commissions, and this creates a lot of transparency in this system, how they are going to be procuring these offshore wind development projects, and it also has greater discretion to these public service commissions. It really opens up a lot. Looking at the public utility commissions, we have the NYPSC, which has a division NYSERDA. Then there's the New Jersey BPU, and then the Maryland PSC. Those are who would be running these solicitations respectively. Looking at some of the language that these have, there's a lot of discretion, and there's a lot of you can see in the language the non-price criteria. For example, section 48.223 in New Jersey states that service in a manner that tends to conserve and preserve the quality of the environment and prevent pollution of the waters, land, and air of the state. This is really where they're able to look for these non-price criteria. In New York, the public service law, section 5.2, states for the public safety, the preservation of environmental values, and the conservation of natural resources. This is really essential. They weight these considerations. So for example, New Jersey has 30% of non-price criteria. That's the focus of economic, environmental, and fishery impacts. New York, it's 10% into their project viability, which would include these non-price criteria. And then Maryland doesn't have a set amount and weight for their positive net benefits, but they are looking for those positive net benefits. Next slide, please. As time has gone on, things have been really improving in this in these solicitations for non-price criteria. More has been added. For example, New York is taking suggestions from their environmental technical working groups about acoustically quiet projects, considering marine mammals. However, that has not been added statutorily. New York is using their discretion to add that. New Jersey is using their discretion where they're allowed to take any additional info that they need for these solicitations, and that's moving them to require even more information of these impacts in their environmental protection plans. And then Maryland, which is really exciting, is they are not requiring, but suggesting a 6-month research information, like what research they'll be going in. And this helps to aggregate a lot of data in this field. So you can see that they're really using these discretions, this discretionary power that they're given to push this non-price criteria. Next slide, please. The other group, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, they are soliciting for energy. They don't have ORECs. There's a much greater involvement of the utilities, and they help shape these procurements. And PUCs is a more evaluative role, where they're not in full control, but there's a lot of interconnection between agencies to help get these through. For example, Massachusetts, the DOER proposes a timetable and consults with an independent evaluator. And then in the end, the DPU assists with that independent evaluator for making these long-term contracts. This is also true for Rhode Island, the long-term contract standards for renewable energy. This is a multi-stage process. In stage 2, they're looking at the non-price criteria. This is a collaboration of the Office of Energy Resources, Division of Public Utilities and Carriers, and there's that emphasis on ratepayers. Connecticut uses DEEP, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. They create a commission of environmental standards. And again, there's the combination of DEEP, PURPA, and OCC to come together. And that's under 1971 to create a mitigation plan. There are weights here for the non-price criteria, similar to the OREC states. Massachusetts uses a 30-point system out of 100 for non-price criteria, but only 15 of that goes to economic development and project impact. But they do, kind of like Maryland, have that data collection, not required, but it is encouraged, and there is preferential treatment to projects. Rhode Island has a 20-point system for their non-price criteria out of 100. And then Connecticut has a 25 qualitative points out of 100 for adaptive management plans. And again, we see in all of these that avoidance, minimization, and mitigation. And all of these together, you see in a state like Connecticut, where you have this cooperation between all of these agencies, this interagency work helps to shape what these solicitations look like and how they can move forward to get this energy in and have those considerations for the environment, ratepayers, and the economy as a whole. With that, I can send it on to John, and he can discuss more about some other states that are doing the solicitations and beginning their process.
Awesome. Thank you, Irvin. So I'm looking at a much smaller pool of states, but basically Maine, California, and Oregon. And these states provide some of the largest possible wind resources that can come online in the future. And like, as you can see on the screen, there are the different like goals that different states are not looking at. But basically, when it comes down to each of these states, they're all kind of in their different stage, but all trying to perform to a new level or to mirror something that we may have seen before from what Irvin has just mentioned. And what's great is that California has just recently closed on 2 solicitations for their offshore. Oregon had looked at some research to develop their offshore wind, which would, I think, be in close proximity to where California would be looking. And then Maine, they've gone through a lot of back and forth over the past decade between their legislature and their Public Utility Commission. And they recently just decided on more of a strategic plan to develop those resources. But from what we see over all these areas, like where the tensions, like what's happening, it's what are the interests like that they want to protect. And then a lot of this has to come into with like fishing and other commercial interests about where those priorities lie and how those like stakeholders would be impacted. But effectively, each of these states has a like well-intentioned and well laid out plan thus far, but obviously they need to develop more granular detail to figure out exactly where what the states want to look at. And to have a more broad overview, we can look at BOEM in our next slide, please. Yeah, so basically with BOEM, so Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, they look at what they call a multiple factor auction format, as you can see here in MFA. And basically they have different like credits for either monetary like factors or non-monetary factors. And monetary factors are all the things you're probably thinking about what comes into a project. So we don't much care about that. But where the real detail comes in is on the non-monetary factors. And right now it's mainly like workforce development or like infrastructure, which is great and all, but not what would be concerned with like environmental quality or ecosystem development or habitat impact. And that's where like a real innovation can happen with BOEM is over these like very new emerging areas. And it's great with BOEM is that they have the ability to change these requirements and procedures every solicitation cycle, and they have been known to do that. So the more we know, the more we can push forward and the better that BOEM can do. So with that, I'd like to hand this off to Kira, who will talk about Europe.
Thanks, John. So yeah, Europe has been a leader in offshore wind over the past several years. Their industry has been around a lot longer than ours has, so we can learn a lot from what they've been doing so far. They currently have 15 gigawatts of installed capacity and many more in the works. And when they started building offshore wind, price was the only deciding factor, but recently that's been changing. There are 3 main European Union laws that impact or govern offshore wind. The first is the state aid rules, also known as the guidelines, which expressly permit state subsidized auctions, but those auctions are limited to using only 30% non-price criteria in the bids. So the state member states are allowed to go above and beyond that, but they can't be using government funds to subsidize the auctions in those cases. The next law is the Renewable Energy Directive, also known as RED II, which sets the binding EU-wide decarbonization goals, which are in line with the Paris Agreement. And also expedites permitting so that the maximum length for renewable energy permitting in any member state is 2 years for the whole process to go through. And the RED II also allows this one-stop shop permit. So instead of getting a permit for the lease and then a permit for operation and a permit for construction, they bundle all of those permits into just one permit. And for example, in the Netherlands, they use this to have one permit that includes the lease area, the preliminary study for the engineers, the interconnection substation, and construction and operating permit for up to 40 years. The last little bit of legislation that we need to look at is the Marine Spatial Planning Directive, which is the framework for sustainable use and conservation of marine resources. So that coordinates the needs of the fishing industry, the ecosystems in the ocean, all the trade and offshore wind. Next slide. Right, so Europe's been taking some aggressive steps to increase the weight and types of non-price criteria. Like I said before, if any member state is doing a subsidized auction, they can only use up to 30% non-price criteria. But if they decide to not subsidize the auction, the the limit does not exist for how much non-price criteria can be used. So the Netherlands was using a 50% weight for protection, for either protection and expansion of biodiversity in the North Sea, or for promoting innovation to system integration. But they've been using either one or the other for their bids, but their most recent auction they did included both in the 50% weight for non-price criteria. Germany has also been doing non-subsidized auctions with 40% non-price criteria, which includes decarbonization as one of the factors that they looked at. And then Belgium has been doing a whole lot for such a small country. They only control 0.5% of the North Sea, but they currently have 2 gigawatts in installed capacity and are working on another 3.5 gigawatts. They have 2 different types of auctions that they're doing. They're still using the subsidized 30% non-price criteria auctions for most of the area that they're in control of, but they also are building in Nature 2000 zones, which are just marine preserves. And in those areas, because they're protected areas that are supposed to be for ecological and biodiversity protection, they don't consider price at all in those areas. They're only looking at what development can do for net positive, nature positive offshore wind. And so they have zero bid auctions in those areas, which is pretty interesting. Next slide. And then, so we can look at, in Europe, there's a lot of common elements throughout all member states that are doing offshore wind. Their common elements include environmental surveys before the auctions are even started, independent panels of experts who develop and evaluate non-price criteria for bids, transparency and specificity in non-price criteria scoring, and flexibility in how net gains can be met. Additionally, net positive non-price criteria are seen as a conflict management tool because they recognize the impacts of development and that those impacts will increase as each country works towards their procurement goals. So, addressing ecological function and biodiversity now is key to unlocking future development potential in Europe and across the world. And I'll send that over to Mark.
Thank you, Kira, John, and Irvin. So just before we move to our Q&A session, just want to come back and sort of do some conclusion thoughts about the report. What we're trying to give you is going to help to understand the process in which things move through. Irvin kind of dived in and talked about what's happening at the state solicitation level and how are those solicitations designed, and showed some words and talked about how words matter. And if you want to bookend with what Kira is talking about, that where Europe is moving and how words matter in their solicitations, and a recognition that you can design projects and construct and operate them in a way that increases biodiversity and enhances ecological function. But we're not doing that right now in the US. We're focusing on mitigating negative impacts, not maximizing environmental benefits. BOEM, which is running the lease auctions and auctioning off lease areas for development in those areas, or when companies secure a lease, are then turning around and bidding into these state solicitation processes, submitting proposals to that. So the federal government process very much focused on labor and workforce development, which puts more attention onto what the states can do and what potential they might have to make changes. And if we want to make those changes, if we want to achieve those benefits, well, we need to have purposeful actions by state regulators who say, this is what will be in a solicitation. These are the factors that we want to consider. But state regulators act upon authority granted to them by legislatures, or directions given to them by governor's offices. So we need grants of legislative authority, clear statements of public policy, if we're going to move forward on achieving the potential benefits that exist. Benefits that Europe is moving on, benefits that the US could be moving on, especially as we move from 7 turbines in the water to thousands of turbines in the water over the next 1 or 2 decades. So it is a moment, it is an opportunity to make change, but we need to think about how we want to do that, and do our institutions allow that. And that's really what we want to take away from the report, is to identify where there are opportunities and identify where there's a need for change. And with that, we welcome your questions, and we encourage you to read the report. My email address is here, and to reach out and contact us with your comments and your questions. We view this as the beginning of a conversation, and we're very much looking forward to engaging with you and with other stakeholders as the offshore wind build out picks up speed. And with that, I will turn it to Trish, and we can begin the question and answer session.
Thanks so much. I had to unmute myself there. So thanks so much for sharing your incredible work and knowledge with us. We really appreciate this report. It sounds like states have a unique opportunity to influence how offshore wind projects are being built, and how these projects might contribute to broader policy objectives, particularly marine net gain. But in order for that to happen, I think, Mark, as you were saying, words matter, and decision makers at the state level have to be given the authority, the guidance, the capacity to influence those projects. I wanted to talk, I guess, a little bit or follow up a little bit, because there are a number of questions in the chat related to this on really the guidance around marine net gain, and how we go about establishing essentially the right baseline data for environmental impacts, kind of where we start with that baseline. Are we using the baseline today? Are we using a historical baseline? And then how are we measuring, how are we designing essentially an assessment structure that allows us to evaluate objectively whether we're achieving net gain or net positive impact. And actually, I'm going to turn to Chris McGuire, who wasn't presenting because he's our more of our science person from Massachusetts Ocean Program at TNC, and ask if maybe he can ground us a little bit in kind of all the science piece of this, to understand a little more clearly what we know and what we don't know, or what we need to know. So sorry to put you on the spot there, Chris, but I hope maybe you can jump in on that.
Yeah, thanks, Trish, and great presentation by everyone. As we think about like the metrics and creating this net positive impact, there's a few important things. First, we need to have a good sense of where we are now before construction. And so there's actually quite a bit of work going on, supported by the states, by the developers, by the federal governments, as we're just ramping up with construction to really understand baseline conditions. For example, we're involved in a project looking at the distribution and and sort of complexities around spawning cod off the coast of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. That way we have a good baseline understanding of what's going on with that resource, and then we can go back and revisit that at some time in the future and see whether or not there's been any positive or negative effect on something like that. So baseline research is happening at a tremendous level right now. We already know a good bit about some species, and there are other gaps that we've been trying to fill. And then as the other thing that's happening is that as the first developments are just beginning, there's quite a bit of research happening during construction to really understand what is the impact of pile driving? How is sound transmitted through the water? How far does the sound carry? So there's a lot of research that's going on right now. And then one of the most challenging questions in science always is separating, sort of correlation from causation. And that is going to remain to be very difficult because we exist in an era of shifting baselines. So we're in the process of seeing a lot of environmental change. Species are changing distribution. And we're also introducing offshore wind into the environment. And so it's going to be very difficult actually, in post for people to really understand whether or not a certain change is a climate related change or an offshore wind related change. But that's the goal of these studies that have been pretty carefully designed to have like before, after comparisons made. Maybe I'll stop there.
Great, that was really helpful. I wonder if, just because I wanted to go back a little bit to, we touched on this a little bit in the presentation, but wanted to go back a little bit to how Europe is proceeding here. And I wondered, Kira, if you could talk a little bit more about why the European countries are motivated really to try to incentivize this designing for or incorporation of net biodiversity positive strategies or investments in marine net gain.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the EU has basically chosen to incentivize these nature positive investments and innovation in their offshore wind auctions to address future issues that could impair their decarbonization efforts. So I talked a little bit about how RED 2 has the decarbonization efforts for the whole of the European Union, and that's tied to the Paris agreements. And since the offshore wind industry in Europe has been around a bit longer, they've seen that the market is basically capable of handling a lower emphasis on price and more on net gains. And so because the market can handle it, they are taking advantage of that.
I'm just kind of scrolling through here. There's so many great questions in here. So let me maybe Mark, you can take this question. Obviously, this presentation and one of the focuses of this report is around designing for net positive impact on biodiversity and environmental considerations. But there are other community policy objectives, concerns about the effects or benefits to communities. And I wondered if in the research, or if you could just speak to how non-price criteria are being used to address some of those broader community objectives as well. And I think John touched on this a little bit, that there's in the BOEM multiple factor auction, there are requirements around supply chain and infrastructure and other types of policy objectives.
Yes, I can do that. And we are seeing that non-price criteria have been used in a number of solicitations, and historically states have done multiple solicitations to achieve specific goals. And often that is because we're at the beginning of the offshore wind build out, it is economic development. It is supply chain, domestic supply chain initiatives. It is workforce training. Things where states are seeing their additional economic benefits to the offshore wind industry and trying to capture those. So we are seeing this non-price criteria have been designed to do that, and that is mirrored at the state level by what is happening at the federal level. The federal government has set clear policy goals for building domestic supply chain, for workforce training. But I think, as Kira had mentioned, and even John had hinted at, these use of non-price criteria as a conflict management tool. And that is where I think that we've seen an evolution into using them for community benefits agreements to advance certain labor standards, whether it's union or union type jobs. So we're seeing this move into more social non-price criteria. How do we advance certain social goals that we want to have from that? I think the next logical step is then to move it into what are the environmental goals that we wish to achieve? How do we, offshore wind will obviously help with decarbonization goals, but what else can it do to go beyond that? And as Chris mentioned, it's beginning to collect the data that allows those non-price criteria to be advanced, that are actually going out to seek a net gain or produce enhanced biodiversity or ecological function. So it is this logical step forward of like, we have economic goals that aren't always matched by what's in the price. Well, we have some social and cultural goals. We would see their benefits. We want to achieve those. The environmental ones, I think, are the next step. And that's what our report really is focusing on, is how do we take those next steps, and are the conditions in place to allow for that?
Great. So since this, I'm curious, since we're hosting this webinar out of TNC Massachusetts, are there any specific insights you have into what Massachusetts is doing or could be doing? And is that Irvin?
Yes, I can
that?
actually build off of what Mark was just speaking on. One thing that I think is really special about Massachusetts solicitation is, in one of its non-price criteria requirements is environmental justice, identifying impacted communities, and the avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts and burdens on those communities through these projects. I think that's a relatively unique part that Massachusetts has. I would say I would love if it was more than 15% out of the 100% going to economic development and project impacts. 20% would be fantastic. But also the data collection that they're requesting, when looking at data collection, if you're able to have effectively a compendium of this previous data, it will take some of the burden off of future production, and be able for these, future development, and these future projects would be able to have a lower threshold for entrance. So I think Massachusetts is really putting itself in a good position with systems in place like that for the solicitations.
Thank you. So there are a couple of questions. I think it might be helpful to just talk a little bit about the role of the government, the federal government, versus the role of the state. And I can certainly speak to that. I don't know if Mark, you want to speak to that, but there's some questions in the chat about, if the states only have jurisdiction out to 3 nautical miles, how can they really influence what's happening with these projects beyond that distance from shore? And what's the role, how does the state role square up with the federal role in this arena?
Sure. Well, I'll talk to that, Tricia, and I'll have you add in, because my knowledge of the Coastal Zone Management Act is less than yours. But we're saying, what are states regulating? They're regulating their distribution utilities that are operating within the state, and asking and setting conditions on how those utilities go out and procure energy, or if they are having to secure offshore renewable energy credits. So they're putting conditions on those utilities, which are then transferred into the request for proposal and the bids that are received. So the bidders who are coming in and submitting applications saying, here's what we want you to do. Yes, we have the exclusive, once you move into the outer continental shelf and what becomes exclusive federal jurisdiction, and much of the activity will be happening there. But states are within their authorities to regulate the activities of utilities that operate within their state borders. And I'm not sure if you want to add anything on to that, Tricia.
I think it's a really good question, because it's important to distinguish kind of what's being regulated at what point in the process. So there's the environmental permitting, and there's the leasing. There's kind of who owns what in the ocean space, and that's really place-based. So states have jurisdiction, place and policy-based, in terms of kind of coastal policies and impacts or effects to the coastal zone of states from certain activities. So when we're talking about the role of the federal government or the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, we're looking at beyond that 3 nautical mile, where they have the authority to lease lands on the outer continental shelf, and they have the authority to conduct the environmental assessment associated with activities that are taking place within those lease areas. States can influence that through the Coastal Zone Management Act, as Mark alluded to. Environmental permitting, and not so much. Am I back? I think I broke up. Okay, that's really about environmental permitting and not so much about, okay, so once the company gets the lease and they have the permit to build the project, who's buying the energy? In the United States, that's a competitive process. So these developers are competing for buyers. They're basically coming into the market and saying, my project is priced more reasonably, or my project can be designed in a way that responds to the policy objectives that you have set as a state better than these other projects that I'm competing against. And that's really where this conversation about what kind of influence can a state, actually more influence than they have through the Coastal Zone Management Act, have over the way these projects are designed by inserting some of these non-price criteria, really policy objectives, into the buying process. And if we're going to do that, and that's what a lot of these questions are kind of alluding to, and I think we're all kind of struggling with, how do we evaluate? How do we compare what's better and what's worse when we're selecting those projects with the non-price criteria? So I hope that kind of answered the question. There's a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm doing my best.
Just on the note of comparing, Trish, I think it's important. We can. Kira had the chance to look at it, but if you look to Europe, they use independent. The Netherlands has an independent panel of experts that actually will go through and help develop the criteria and then evaluate the criteria. So they recognize the need to move this to a group of people who have this specialized knowledge in order to be able to do evaluations of qualitative criteria. This is not purely numbers based. But that is not a hindrance to doing it, as Europe is showing that there are ways to evaluate qualitative proposals that might differ in elements other than their cost.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit about what do developers think about all of this? And how are they responding maybe differently to these criteria around the North Sea and Europe and in the United States? Do they think this is a good thing, a bad thing? Are they asking for more non-price criteria? Do you have a sense of that? I wonder.
Well, we can look at what's actually happened in some of the tender processes in Europe. The one that was pointed in Holland, where 50% of the bid price was weighted towards investments in and innovation in the ecology of the North Sea, and the winning bid was selected out of 47 bids. So it is not a deterrent to developers who are seeking to bid projects and to be successful with that. They are investing in developing proposals that can do that. And I think there was a TNC report that was put into the chat about the design and operation, construction of the facilities. That the science knows there are differences in how those facilities respond based upon what materials are used and how they are laid out and what construction practices are employed. So developers are leading on sort of gathering that information, and they would. What we've been told and what we saw is that they would be interested in using that information and leverage in the US, but they need structures that incentivize and reward them for doing so. We're seeing that in Europe. We are not seeing that in the US, and consequently, there is a difference between how developers are putting together their proposals and the types of practices and processes that they are suggesting on using.
I know Irvin has a lot of thoughts on this, and we we talked a little bit earlier about not going there, but I'm going to go there, I think, on the difference between the ORECs and buying kind of the renewable energy credits versus buying the energy itself. And the reason that I think it's important to go there is to follow up on this conversation that we're having right now with Mark, which is that when I look at, for example, the Maryland process, it seems very transparent. It seems like there's a lot of opportunity for the public to understand why this particular project was chosen over this project. There's, and so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the Maryland process and how that differs from some of the other processes where we're allowing the utilities to select the bidder, and just maybe, I don't know, share some thoughts to spark conversation about the difference between ORECs and the utility selecting the bidder. And I won't just lean on you, Irvin. I think Mark can jump in as well. However you want to start there. I won't leave you hanging. I'll jump in too, but I think it's a worthwhile conversation.
I do wholeheartedly agree with you. We discussed a little bit before the webinar. My default is OREC is the way to go. I love that transparency. I really like the discretion that's given to the public utility commissions. And if you look at New York and New Jersey, I mean, I'm not leaning on Maryland, as you mentioned, but those two are states where you see that there are provisions that give them the power to have their discretion, to have that flexibility. And that discretion and flexibility ends up being passed on to these developers who are responding to these RFPs. I have a little bit of wariness with that, in that there's nothing statutorily requiring that they keep these non-price criteria as they are. But we have seen, as time has gone on, these non-price criteria with all of these stakeholder considerations have been going up, and have been, there's more considerations, and they're better considerations. Looking at then, though, a state that's procuring energy and not an OREC, those are much more, there's a lot of this interplay between these agencies. Now, I'm not saying it's not happening for states that have ORECs, but we even talked about this the other day. This is a question that needs a 10-part answer. And I personally lean on 1 or 2 parts. I really think that using these ORECs is helpful, and it's looking at the highest. You look at these states that have the ORECs; they also have the highest goals, which those are going to be hard to meet. But it's ambitious, and I think it gives them the ability to do so because there's not quite as much red tape. I mean, there's obviously red tape, but it's a different process that I think works a little bit better. I think it just ekes out the non-OREC states.
Do you want to add something, Mark?
I'm just going to add in that states that are using ORECs, I think there's we're going back to this word transparency, that there's a transparency in the process for how they are developed and the rules around how they will be solicited. And that is part of the Public Utility Commission process. So having the Public Utility Commission being engaged earlier on, there is an opportunity for utilities, the state agencies, as well as interested third parties to provide comments and suggestions, and for in advance of the Utility Commission issuing an order saying, here's how we're going to run the RFP, run the request for proposals that Irvin was just talking about. And I have seen it. You can go and read and we cited in our report in Maryland, that there are environmental nonprofits providing very specific suggestions on here's what conditions should be put into this solicitation. So having that process at the beginning where there's some openness and transparency and the ability for stakeholders, multiple stakeholders, and many stakeholders to participate in that process allows for a greater discussion of options and what goals we want to achieve with this process.
So I don't want to put all of this on the states or all of it on developers in this conversation. And I'm wondering if we've touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if we can talk a bit more about, do we think that there really is a better, is this really better housed, this incentivizing housed with BOEM through the leasing format, as opposed to having every state that's buying power have impose different set of policy objectives and requirements on developers that are sharing essentially a regional ecosystem. So it's a big question, but I don't know who wants to jump in on that, but it's really going back to, like, could we be doing more with how we weight criteria in who wins the lease up front, as opposed to driving this really from the state buying perspective?
Yeah, so I could try and tackle that just a little bit with BOEM. So like they absolutely have the power to like oversee all of this. However, when we've asked them, like personally in an interview that we're doing to conduct our research, they straight up said, no, we will not do that. Like even they say they'll go like straight to the line, letter of the law, and that they defer to the states to handle all of these things. But like, yeah, in their like governing statute, they can definitely direct like what specific standards they want to see, but I think they want to leave it up to the states to decide. One, possibly for just it's so new, they can't possibly cover every prescriptive thing that they'd want to look at. Also, they don't know. And then also partially with like just from a like lawsuit point of view, they kind of mentioned like they want to avoid like any like legal action, any litigation. That said, they may have overstepped, so they're keeping it really close to their chest. But yeah, at the end of the day, BOEM could say whatever they want about this, but they haven't, and they're not looking to, unless what they had pointed out, unless like legislation is passed to say, yes, we must consider these specific things. But as we all know, that would take a very long time. And who knows, by the time that would happen, it might be too late for the things we care about today.
Chris, do you think that it's because, I mean, they are clearly, BOEM is looking at some non-price, including federal government policy objectives, right? I mean, they're looking at giving added weight to developers who are going to help support a build out of the supply chain, or in some places are putting forward proposals about how they respond to or contribute to fisheries compensation. Do you think this is really more getting back to that first question that we asked about how do we measure success at that level? Or do you think in terms of like the data and proving that we're actually contributing to something ecologically valuable?
Well, at the symposium that we hosted about this in April, I'm sorry, there were some comments made that basically it's very difficult to measure success. And I think that there is some caution by regulators in putting themselves in that position of being the arbiters of success. So I do think that that is something that we heard people say at the symposium. So that may certainly be a piece of it. I think the other thing that could possibly be going on is that this is a pretty new idea in the US, as the presentation has shown. I mean, a lot of countries in Europe are a little bit farther ahead on the idea of net positive impacts. And so it may just take some time to work that into the process.
Great. So we're approaching the end of our time today. Clearly, 1 hour is not enough time to talk about this topic. And we have so many really insightful and important questions in the chat that we weren't able to get to. But I think, we are intent on continuing this conversation and trying to drill down on many of the questions that have been asked. So they will not be lost, even though they were not answered in full today. I wonder if you have anything else that you want to share as a panel, just before we kind of wrap up.
I just have a couple of touches. I want to come back and say thank you again to the Nature Conservancy for the opportunity to do this research and to present it. And I think my takeaway is that as Chris just mentioned, we're at the beginning or on the cusp of something. So if this is a policy objective, if this is a goal we wish to achieve, we need to think about the structures and institutions that are at play right now. And if we do that now, then we can get those results and and capture those potential benefits 5, 10, 15 years down the road. But awareness and action start today, so those results can be captured later on. If we delay trying to tackle some of the tough questions, then we would delay possibly achieving all the potential benefits that do exist from offshore wind. So things are moving, and we should be moving too. And I had my email on the slides, and I'm happy to take any more questions and to talk more about how we move this idea and this project forward.
Great, thank you, and thank you especially to all of the students who worked really tirelessly this semester on this report. I hope all of you who have joined us today will have a chance to look at that and read through it. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is what makes all of this work possible. We will be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with a link to a recording of this webinar. If you are enjoying our webinars, please be sure to share them with your friends and colleagues. And you can follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on our upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. As always, you can register for future webinars at nature.org/MA webinars. And during our next webinar on June 15th, we'll be joined by our colleagues from Massachusetts to hear about TNC's clean water work along the Massachusetts coast and how nutrient pollution threatens coastal ecosystems, communities, and economies on Cape Cod and around the world. So please join us. Thank you again and have a wonderful afternoon.